Good morning. Thank you for joining again this series of talks on the life of our Father, St. Francis. I hope you're well. Now you're wearing masks regularly, which we're told we must do when we're outside and going into places. That's a good thing to do. It's to keep others safe. And my goodness gracious, we want this to come to an end, this pandemic. So anyway, it's the year 1205, a pivotal year in St. Francis' life, the year of Francis' conversion. He was 23 years old. He'd been in battle and was a failure 2 times. Father Tom Spire, who I'm depending upon for much of my material, who, by the way, has been living in our friary here and just moved to a different friary yesterday. Anyway, Father Tom, excellent to have an expert living with you, believed that Francis suffered post-traumatic stress syndrome, that there's evidence in his life of what we call today PTSD. They didn't use those terms back in Francis' day, but Francis suffered. But it was in the course of his recovering from his failure and his injuries, and he did have injuries in battle, that Francis had a dream asking him whom he wished to serve, the servant or the master. And Francis said, the master. And then, why are you serving then the servant? Francis realized it was the Lord talking to him, inviting him to serve him, the master. This was the first step in Francis' conversion. And as we discussed last week, Francis, who encountered lepers outside the walls of Assisi and had this amazing encounter with the leper as he was passing by on his horse, Francis was. The leper was begging. Francis got down off of his horse and went and embraced the leper. And the story says the leper disappeared. Francis realized he was embracing Jesus. Anyway, he went to serve the lepers in San Salvatore Infirmary, which was staffed by the Croziers. An early biographer wrote, he washed all the filth from them, and he even cleaned out the pus from their sores. It's pretty graphic. His earliest biographer, Thomas of Celano, described him this way. He used to say that the sight of lepers was so bitter to him that in the days of his vanity, when he saw their houses even 2 miles away, he'd cover his nose with his hands, probably to impress his friends. You just see this young man trying to act smart. But God was working on Francis, and Francis was allowing God to work on him, on his spirit. We know that St. Francis was an all-or-nothing kind of guy. He wanted a cause. He initially thought it was military prowess. He would make his fellow citizens, he would make his father very proud. But life dealt him a blow, as we've discussed. And recovering, he had time to think and time to pray. It was during this time that Francis, who was given to prayer and who listened with a generous spirit, a generous heart to the Lord, because remember, he had believed he heard the Lord say, "Francis, whom do you serve?" The master of the servant felt the Lord would lead him further. He used to pray in a little run-down chapel called San Damiano, St. Damien. One day in December of 1205, he was praying in this little chapel before a large wooden crucifix with the image of the crucified, which spoke to him in a kind and tender voice. "Francis, don't you see that my house is being destroyed? Go then and rebuild it for me." Francis knew again that just as with the leper, just as in his dream earlier, that the Lord was speaking to him. Whether there was a voice or not, scholars debate that. But he knew Christ was speaking to him. And the cross that he was praying in front of was what we call the San Damiano cross, because it was in the chapel of San Damiano. If you notice, my background today is an example, a copy of the cross that spoke to Francis. And we're still in the Friars Chapel. That's where I'm speaking from. The last couple talks I've spoken from are ambo or lectern, but this seemed to be a fitting place today to speak. So you could see the cross that spoke to Francis. It's a large Byzantine cross. It was probably painted in the early 12th century, so before Francis, and it hung for centuries in the Basilica of St. Clare of Assisi in Assisi. But very recently it was moved, which is a little monastery with a little chapel, and that was the chapel that Francis was praying in, and the original cross hangs there. It was hidden for centuries, but now you can pray for that. Go to Francis, don't you see that my house is being destroyed? Go then and rebuild it for me. Look at the cross. What's different about this cross? Well, Christ is on the cross, but look, he's standing. Experienced Christ. He looks very much in control. He has no crown of thorns. He has wounds in his hands, his feet. There's no crown on his head, because you see, it's Christ. A little more about this experience. This is from a lovely biography of St. Francis by Gilbert Keith Chesterton. You know, the great literature writer, G.K. Chesterton. I remember studying some of his writings in college. Well, he wrote a biography of St. Francis, of transition that followed the tragical collapse of all his military ambitions, probably made bitter by some loss of social prestige, terrible to his sensitive spirit. And as he did so, he heard a voice Francis, seest thou not that my house is in ruins? Go and restore it for me. Francis sprang up and went. To go and do something was one of the driving demands of his nature. As we've seen, generous of spirit. Probably he'd gone and done it before he had all thoroughly thought out what had to be done. In any case, what he had done was something very decisive and immediately very disastrous for his social career. In the coarse conventional language of the uncomprehending world, Francis stole. For him to repair this church, he needed money. So he took cloth from his father, the cloth merchant, very valuable cloth, and he took it and sold it so that he could make money to refinish this church, rebuild this church. Let me read to you another account. This is from a biography that I referred to before, Gerard Straub's The Sun and Moon over Assisi. If you'll bear with me while I get the right page. I thought I had a bookmark, but what I really need is a desk. I've got this lectern in front of me, and I can't lay stuff out. Here's what Straub wrote. The cross is crucial in Francis' conversion and spirituality. When Francis knelt at the foot of the large cross, which hung in the small chapel of San Damiano, his life was transformed. Francis was educated by what he saw. Creation, beggars, lepers, his followers. He looked hard and long at the cross of San Damiano. The cross told a story, a visual story with a profound theological message, which acted as a portal through which Francis could enter into the mystery of God. To the untrained Western eye, icons, and this cross was an icon, they appear at first glance to be rather odd and strange. The figures in their expressions seem exaggerated and out of proportion. He writes, the first few times I looked at the cross of San Damiano, I saw little more than the figure of Christ on a cross. I was totally unaware of the symbols employed by the iconographer, who was a 12th century monk. And I didn't know how to read the picture he had painted. Perhaps you know that when you are with an icon, you read the icon. And he says, for instance, the tiny shells that form the border around the entire cross symbolize eternity, beauty, and endurance. And he studied more and came to appreciate its beauty. But as Chesterton pointed out, in this moment of hearing, of reading, of experiencing the Lord, Francis generously wanted to respond positively, but he needed money to do that. And so he stole from his father. And his father put him under house arrest. By this time, his father was really discouraged by his son, who wasn't turning out at all the way he had hoped. His mother, Lady Pica, freed him when Pietro was on one of his trips. And Francis went to the bishop. This was in the year 1206. Now, there is some debate over whether his father took him to the bishop. This was for a trial, or Francis himself went. The bishop helped him find ways to return the money to his father. Francis wanted something more radical, to do what the Lord was asking him to do. He needed to get out from under his father's care. The bishop held a trial. Francis, in the presence of the bishop and of his father, stripped himself of his clothes. Another dramatic scene. According to the early biographers, he said, "I no longer call Pietro Bernardoni my father. I just want to say, Our Father, who art in heaven." Francis was standing there naked. Guido, the bishop, covered him in his cope. He now was under the bishops in sort of the role of a penitent. Father Tom writes, he was finally free of the security and status of family in time to fulfill his dream of knighthood. He was a knight of Christ. Brothers and sisters, if perchance you've seen the movie by Franco Zeffirelli, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, it came out in the 50s. It's a gorgeous movie. Zeffirelli also did Romeo and Juliet, another beautiful movie. It's a very romantic telling of the life of Francis in beautiful color, set over in Assisi. You'll appreciate this particular scene. It's very dramatic. In the town square, there's Francis, there's the bishop, there are other people around, there's his dad. Francis strips himself of his clothes, and we see him walking to the hillside, surrounded by the gate, looking out over the land. He's naked. You see him from behind, and he sees all the world, which is now his, because he was willing to take that bold step. We'll continue our story. There's so much more in the life of this marvelous man. And I thank you for staying here and joining me. Have a wonderful week.